Hello everyone. Thank you all for watching the video. Wishing you all good health and peace. The dawn spilled over the village like a quiet song, its light threading through the mist, brushing the guava trees that stood heavy beyond the dike. Deep stood by a sagging fence, her hands clutching a bamboo basket, its strands worn as her dreams. The air was thick with dew and charcoal, woven with the cluck of chickens and the soft rush of a stream winding through the hills. Hockey, her small dog, nudged her ankle, his frame thin from wandering, his eyes bright with hunger, but even his warmth couldn't ease the flutter in her chest. Today James would come, his boots ready for the fields, his laughter a promise of the life they dreamed. A farm, a home, a love that grew deeper than roots. But as the village woke, she wondered if her heart, like the guavas she'd pick, could hold its sweetness against the worms of doubt. She stepped onto the dirt path, her sandals sinking into the earth, each footfall a whisper of her past. The village was a tapestry of memory, palm roofs glinting under the sun, a market where voices bartered greens and fruit, a stream that glittered like scattered coins. She'd come here broken, a girl sold as a child, her name her only shield until Tuan had found her, his voice cracking with truth. "You're my sister," he'd said, and their mother had wept, her hands mapping the birthmark on Deep's neck, a guide to a family lost for 20 years. They'd sat in a shack, weaving baskets by lamplight, the air thick with rice and forgiveness. "You're home," her mother had said, her cough a soft wound, and Deep had clung to it, a spark against the dark she'd wandered. Her mother's hands had taught her to weave, each strand a lesson in patience, a map of love she'd carried through the years. She'd been a child then, barely 5, when an uncle had sold her, his coins heavy with betrayal. She'd lived with strangers, her name a secret, until she'd fled, a girl of 12, her heart a drumbeat against fear. Tuan had found her in a market, his eyes wide with recognition, and brought her to their mother, her cough already a shadow. "You're mine," she'd said, and Deep had wept, her hands learning rice, her heart learning home. But home was fragile, built on borrowed breath, and her mother's illness lingered, a cancer pressing harder now, its weight heavy in the surgery Tuan planned after Tet. Tuan's burdens had scarred him, his hands once empty, now steadier with work, but his voice carried worry, papers undone as Tet's lanterns loomed. He'd met James yesterday, his head bowed, asking for money to save their mother. "After Tet," he'd said, "she needs surgery." James had listened, his face calm but firm, and offered help, a loan not a gift, sealed with a contract to keep things clear. "Health comes first," he'd said, and Tuan had nodded, his pen shaking as he signed, promising to work harder, to learn the machines James would teach him. Deep had heard it all, her heart torn between gratitude and fear, knowing their mother's life hung on coins they didn't have, on a man who loved her but stood worlds apart. The stream glittered now, its waters catching the morning sun, a ribbon of light against the earth. Deep knelt beside it, her fingers trailing in the current, its chill grounding her thoughts. She'd met James here, his truck mired in mud, her laughter shy as she helped him push. "I'm no city man," he'd said, his eyes warm as the soil, and she'd believed him, her heart opening before she knew his wealth. They'd worked the fields together, planting melons, dreaming of a farm where love grew deeper than roots. "This is ours," he'd told her, his voice steady as the hills, and she'd seen a house, a garden, a life woven from their hands. But his father had doubted her, his voice sharp with warnings, "She's not enough," and she'd faltered, her heart torn between love and the fear of being less. Her past was a shadow woven into her steps. She'd been married once, a girl of 16, to a man who saw her as less, his hands heavy, his voice sharp. She'd fled, her name her only map, and built a life. A shack, a garden, a love she thought was hers. James had seen her, not as broken but as whole, and she'd dared to dream with him, to plant more than crops, to grow a future. But her mother's cough, Tuan's debts, had pulled her back, and his father's words, learn read, had lingered, a mirror to her fears. Too simple, too small, a girl whose hands knew only earth, not pages. She'd started reading, her fingers tracing letters by lamplight, each word a step toward James, toward herself. James arrived as the sun climbed, his truck rattling up the path, dust swirling like ghosts. "Ready?" he'd called, his boots new but eager, and she'd smiled, her basket light in her hands. They'd walked 3 kilometers to the guava grove, the air thick with Tet's promise, lanterns in the distance, voices calling for fortune. The trees were heavy with fruit, their skins green and gold, small but sweet, untouched by sprays. "Natural," she'd said, and he'd nodded, his eyes bright with wonder. They'd picked together, his hands clumsy, his laughter loud when ants bit his back. "City boy," she teased, brushing them off, her heart warm with his effort, his joy a mirror to her own. The guavas were small, some worm-eaten but sweet, their crunch a gift of the earth. She'd cut one with a knife, her hand steady, and offered him a piece. "Good?" she'd asked, and he'd grinned, his teeth white against the sun. "Perfect," he'd said, and they'd worked side by side, filling baskets, dodging ants, their voices weaving through the trees. He'd struggled, picking bad fruit, laughing at his mistakes, but she'd seen it. The man who ran factories, who signed deals worth billions, now stained with dirt, happy in her world. "This is life," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her heart full. But her eyes lingered on the worms, a whisper of fear. Could sweetness last? They'd carried their baskets to the market, the village alive with Tet's glow. Stalls heavy with greens, guavas at 15,000 a kilo, lanterns swaying like stars. She'd borrowed a scale, her voice sharp with barter, selling 2 kilos here, 3 there, even dropping to 20,000 when a woman smiled. James had watched, his hands idle, his eyes soft with pride. "You're good," he'd said, and she'd blushed, her coins heavy in her pocket, her heart heavier with doubt. Good enough for him, for his world? She'd bought tea, its steam warm in her hands, and they'd stood together, the market's hum a hymn to the life she loved, the life she feared losing. Tuan had called later, his voice rushed, thanking James for the money. "It's done," he'd said, the contract signed, the transfer made. "I'll work hard," he'd promised, and Deep had listened, her heart tight with hope, with worry. Their mother lay in a hospital bed, her cough softer but stubborn, her hands still weaving baskets in her mind. "She'll be okay," Tuan had said, but Deep had heard the crack in his voice, the weight of a surgery that loomed after Tet. James had spoken of machines, of teaching Tuan to fix them, his voice calm but firm. "Health first," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her gratitude deep as the earth, knowing her family stood because of him, because of love. The shack glowed now, its roof patched, its kitchen alive with the scent of rice. Deep set her basket down, its creak a quiet song, and lit a lamp, its flame dancing like Tet's promise. Hockey curled at her feet, his warmth a fleeting balm, and she thought of her mother, her voice soft with love, her hands tracing patterns only she could see. "You're home," she'd said, and Deep had believed it, wanted to carry it through the years. She'd learned to cook from her, each grain of rice a lesson, each egg a gift from chickens she'd raised. The market had taught her too, its voices sharp with barter, its stalls heavy with green she'd sold to keep them whole. James had stayed, his boots by the door, his voice low with plans. "You're learning fast," he'd said, watching her read, her fingers slow but sure. "I'll get a teacher," he'd promised, "and books, business, strategy." She'd nodded, her heart racing, her eyes on the page, each word a bridge to his world. His father had said it once, learn, grow, and she'd carried it, a spark against her fears. "I want to be enough," she'd whispered, and he'd smiled, his hand warm against hers. "You are," he'd said, but her heart trembled, the worms in the guavas a warning, a whisper of work undone. The village carried on, its rhythm a gentle pulse, roosters crowing, a child's laughter fading into the dusk, the stream's murmur a constant hymn. Deep wandered to the market again, its stalls alive with Tet's glow. Guavas at 10,000, greens tied in twine, a woman selling lanterns with a smile. She'd bought nothing, her coins saved for medicine, but the air was thick with hope, voices calling for fortune, for health, for love that held. She'd thought of her grandmother then, gone these many years, her stories of rivers that carried dreams, of stars that lit the way. "The heart knows," she'd said, and Deep had carried it, a spark against the years she'd been nothing. A girl sold, a wife escaped, a daughter reclaimed. James had spoken of fields, of trees heavy with fruit, of a farm that fed the hungry. "We'll do it together," he'd said, and she'd nodded, her hands ready, her heart full. He'd managed his company, his voice sharp with orders, wood worth billions, machines to mend, papers. Tuan fumbled, and she'd listened, her heart torn between pride and fear. He was city and soil, a man who bridged worlds, and she was earth, her hands stained with mud, her dreams small as the guavas she picked. His father had seen it, his words distant but kind, and promised to watch them, a vow that felt both warm and heavy. "Keep this love," he'd said, and she'd wanted to believe it, to trust the peace he'd offered. The guavas had sold fast, their sweetness a gift of the earth, and she'd counted her coins, her fingers steady, her heart light with the day. James had helped, his hands clumsy but eager, his laughter a song she wanted to keep. "I'll come again," he'd said, and she'd smiled, imagining him in the fields, his suit gone, his hands stained with soil. But her mother's cough lingered. A shadow medicine might not lift, and Tuan's work, though steadier, was a thread that could snap. The worms in the guavas were a warning, a whisper of work undone, and the books James promised were a weight she wanted to carry, a chance to be more. Tet was coming, its lanterns aglow against the dark, a promise of fortune she wanted to hold. She thought of James, his laughter, his plan to trade his suit for soil, to stand with her under the village sky. He'd spoken of trees, of fruit heavy with sweetness, and she'd smiled, her heart wide as the hills. But her mother's surgery loomed, a shadow after Tet's light, and Tuan's papers, scattered with numbers, were a weight that pressed them all. The words she read, slow but sure, were a bridge to James, to herself, but the path was long, its turns hidden in shadow. She thought of the grove the guavas shared, the ants that bit him, the laughter that warmed the air. James had eaten slowly, his eyes bright, and she'd watched, her heart racing, her hands still from picking. "It's good," he'd said, and she'd nodded, but her eyes had lingered on the basket, its weave loud with her fear, too plain, too small, a life he might tire of. He'd spoken of books, of learning, and she'd felt it, the gap between her hands and his world, a chasm she might never cross. But his voice had softened, his promise a spark, and she'd wanted to trust it, to believe he saw her heart, not her shack. The market had been loud, the guavas selling fast, the coins heavy in her pocket. She'd borrowed a scale, her voice sharp with barter, and James had watched, his hands idle, his eyes soft with pride. "You're good," he'd said, and she'd blushed, her heart heavy with doubt. Good enough for him, for his world? She'd bought tea, its steam warm in her hands, and they'd stood together, the market's hum a hymn to the life she loved, the life she feared losing. Tuan had called, his voice rushed, thanking James for the money, promising to work hard to save their mother. Questions lingered, soft as moonlight, heavy as earth. Would her mother heal or fade like the dusk? Would Tuan stand tall or falter under new burdens? Would James with his fields and dreams stay hers, or would doubt, hers his worlds, pull them apart? She thought of the guavas, the sweetness shared, the promise of books, and James's voice. "We'll work together." A vow that held her still. Would their love bloom, a seed in Tet's light, or wither under truths unsaid? She didn't know, and the not knowing was a wound, faint but deep, that pulsed with every breath. Sleep would come later, broken by Hockey's whines and the creak of the shack's walls. For now, deep stood by the stream, the moon high, the village quiet save for its endless hymn. She thought of James, of his promise, of the love they'd forged in fields and dust. The answers weren't here, not yet. They lay beyond the hills in a dawn she couldn't see, and as she turned back to the shack, her steps steady, her soul burned, a flame that trembled but didn't die.